Okay, it's the Tool and Die Guy. In today's video I'm going to show you a few things today, and what I want to do is start off with a basic explanation of what these are. These are called gauge blocks, and every once in a while I have to realize that there's a lot of people coming into the trade now that have never touched these, seen these, or know what they're for. My explanation of gauge blocks are basically that these are the industry standard, and the reason these are the industry standard is these are set to exact measurements and calibrated by the maker, and there's different grades of gauge blocks, and you can look that up online if you're really having trouble sleeping tonight. Rest assured that unless you're doing aerospace and work or something really crazy, that the tolerancing and has to be not as exact, but has to be uniform, as in you're sending stuff overseas to another company that uses the same tolerancing, so everybody's calibrated to the same standard, okay? For the rest of us that are working in a machine shop, a tool and die shop, doing one of this, 5 of that, the gauge block is what we use to set our mics to set our instruments to, because these are the industry standard. This particular set basically goes from 0.100 thousandths of an inch to 4 inches. And when I hold up a 4-inch block here, this is exactly 4 inches. This isn't around 4 inches. As I always joke, this isn't carpentry or plumbing. This is 4 inches, okay? This is 2 inches exactly. And what you do when you work with gauge blocks is you can ring them together. And let's say I had to check a height on a part that was 2.100. I would take my 2-inch gauge block, and when I say ring them together, because these surfaces have been lapped to tolerance, this particular set's about 15 years old, and if I take I can't remember what I said, 2.100. If I take the 2.100, 2 inches, 100, and I just rub them together, they stick. See that? So now I have exactly 2.100. So that's the first thing I want to teach you, is basically what gauge blocks are. Funny story about these gauge blocks. You see it says Mark D here. Mark Dombrowiak was his name, and Mark is no longer in the trade because he broke both arms when he was motocrossing, when he was one of my apprentices. And we had it on film before YouTube was even popular. Mark went over the hill, went about 50 feet in the air, came down on both arms, and he had stuff for sale. So I always think of Mark when I see his gauge blocks. So the next thing I want to show you is how to measure parts and how to use gauge blocks with your indicator, and also give you some tips on proper indicator practices. I was going to say indicator etiquette, but that would be stupid. Alright, so what we have here is I'm using a cast iron surface plate. Most of you, and this is perfectly fine for most of the work I do, but most of you would be more familiar with a granite surface plate, okay? But this will work for our demonstration. As I've said before, I've got my trusty InterRapid indicator. I've explained in one of my other videos why I like this indicator so much. It's just a great indicator, and I've been using these off and on now for about 25 years, and I know everybody out there probably has their favorite indicator that they like to use, and then they get stuck on one because they were trained that way. The good news is I did learn. I used to use stare at last word indicators, and it's the difference between, you know, rowing a boat and putting a motor on it. These are beautiful, and I'm going to show you how you should be checking using an indicator right now. So one of the things I want to teach you is occasionally you'll get, if you're just doing one part and you want to measure it, and it's supposed to be a 1/4 inch thick, you get your mics out and you measure it, okay? Now, one of the things you can use gauge blocks and indicators for is to check multiple pieces of work. It's faster, okay? So for instance, I brought this piece home, this little piece here, and I don't know what the tolerance is on this piece, but I'm going to say, I measured this before I left work, it's 0.245 thick. Now let's say I had a tolerance on this thing of plus or minus 2 thousandths. So it's 0.245 thick, plus or minus 2 thousandths. So what I would want to show you here is what I'm going to do is I'm going to ring up 245 thousandths worth of gauge blocks. So I would take the 145 and the 100, squeeze them together like that, and there they are, they stick together. And then what I'm going to do is set my indicator to that height. Now I'll show you another tip here in a second, but I want to get this right. So I'm going to set a 0 there, and I'm going to double check that a couple times. Basically, a good practice with your indicator is to come from behind. It doesn't jump as much. Okay, so I think we can move that just a little bit. Yeah. Now we have a 0 set. This is 245 thousandths. Now let's say my part was supposed to be 245 thousandths plus 2 thousandths or minus 2 thousandths. So I set my gauge blocks for the mean dimension, 0.245, and then each part I do, I roll under my indicator. Okay? And this part isn't perfectly flat, but it's pretty darn close. And if I was milling, this would be more than fine. What I'm looking for is if this part jumps 2 thousandths either way, then I know I'm getting very close to being out of tolerance, correct? So that is how I do, if I've got a lot of parts of the tight tolerance, instead of measuring each one with my micrometers, I just set a gauge block up, or set a gauge blocks up, bring them together to my nominal height. In this case it was 0.245, and then I know if I've got a 0 set that I can't go 2 thousandths either side of that 0. Now, a couple of things I want to show you here. Notice I'm not using too much of the indicator travel. What I want to show you here is if you buy a used indicator, or you have one that your dad gave you, or you're a home enthusiast, or you've just got this ancient indicator, the way you know an indicator is still good is if you go like this. It should repeat. I'm going to set a 0 there. It means nothing. I'm just showing you. Every time I hit that indicator, if I go from the other side, it should come back to 0 every time. It means the spring is still good, okay? So that's the first lesson in indicators. Second thing I want to show you is, I'm going to back this off a little bit with my thumb screw. When you're checking your parts, use the bare minimum of travel necessary. Like 5 or 6 thousandths if you can. You don't want to use up all the travel on the indicator, because it jumps, it pushes it. So it's more accurate to use the less travel as possible. Like I'm only using about 7 thousandths. This indicator, I believe, has 60 thousandths of travel, and I'm only using 7 of it because that's more accurate. Now watch what happens if I crank this down. I can't even get it under it. Now, I might be able to get under it from the back, but we're going way around, and then you get confused. Was it past this 0 or past that 0? Again, what I'm trying to show you is touch and feel in the industry here. Just use a little bit of your travel. You get a much softer feel, and your indicator isn't jumping all over the place because you're ramming way too much travel into it. So that is how you check your pieces, okay? The last thing I want to show you is you want your indicator point as parallel to your work as possible. And I'm going to take the camera down. I'm going to pause this and start over and show you what I mean by that. Okay, I'm holding the camera by hand right now, so I'm sorry if it's a little jumpy. See how my indicator point is very much parallel, almost parallel to my work, and that's a much more accurate way to do it. What you don't want to get into is doing something like this. If I tilt this up, I'm doing, that's still okay. I don't want to be doing this to check my work. And then I'm going underneath and my piece, and let's see if I can get a better angle here with my other hand. See how that just doesn't look right? I'm bending the indicator. I might be able to get it from behind. That's not the way to do it. You want your indicator point parallel like that. Even a little more would be fine. Okay, and I'm not going to adjust the indicator again, but you see how it's much more parallel to the piece, much more accurate, and it won't jump as much. So there you go. There's 3 great tips for you. I hope these help. What we've talked about today is what gauge blocks are, how to use them, a very brief explanation. You can look more online for mind-numbing information on gauge blocks. We showed you how to use your indicator to check multiple pieces and set a tolerance to 0, and also to use much less travel. Use the minimum travel on your indicator and make sure your indicator point is as parallel to the work you're checking as possible. So I'm Phil Kerner, the Tool and Die Guy, and hey, buy me a beer if this helped, okay?